guys, welcome back to another edition of Cover One Buffalo. As always, I'm Aaron Quinn here with Nate Geary. Man, missed you last week, Nate. How you doing?
I am well. I was at Game 3, which turned out to be probably the best game other than Game 1 of the series. So my first NBA Finals game, it was pretty awesome. So
awesome, man. So welcome back. You missed a crazy, awesome talk about tight ends. If anybody missed that, you can go back, download the podcast. It's up on iTunes. You can check it out on YouTube, as well as the entire offensive side of the ball. We've covered it all. Mm-hmm. So we missed you on the tight ends, Nate, but I'm sure that we covered anything that could be said about those guys, that any of the thoughts that you might have had. So anybody that hasn't gotten a chance, go back, listen to the offense. And now we're over to the defensive side of the ball, man. But before we get into that, I just want to remind everybody to go and download the Cover One app. I know you're a big fan of it, Nate, so why don't you tell people about the Cover One app?
Yeah, so much like the website, I think what I like most about it, though, is the notifications that you get once you download the app. So you know when our podcasts are going live 15 minutes prior. You're getting a notification of us going live, and then obviously any new articles which are dropping now and daily. So it's an easy way to kind of keep up on top of all your Bills stuff. And like I mentioned, it's similar layout to the website, very easy to navigate, everything right in front of you. And obviously the most important thing, Aaron, it's free.
It is free. And the nice thing, too, is even the parts that aren't free are very inexpensive right now. For $10, you can get premium access for the entire year from the time of purchase, and that's access to all the content. I mean, look at all this content that's up here right now, and most of this isn't even premium, so you're already getting a lot of stuff for free, but the premium content is exactly what it says, premium. I mean, just the access to the Slack channel alone, Eric puts in previews of content he's doing before he puts it out there. He talks to the guys about some of the stuff he sees when he's doing his content, so that alone, that access to Eric and the fantastic minds over here at the Cover One Buffalo podcast at all times to have those conversations is worth the one-time $10 payment. But get over there because this content's just flowing. I hadn't checked the site in a couple of days, and I went this morning and pounded 2 to 3 coffees and just went through a bunch of this content, and I loved it. So get over there, check it out, and let's talk about, before we get into the defensive side of the ball, obviously we're talking about the defensive line today. Let's talk a little about OTAs, man, because I haven't had a chance to talk to you about any of this yet, except for seeing what you think on Twitter. What are your thoughts so far from the things that you've seen online for the Bills OTAs? Anything stand out to you right now?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we're headed into the summer, basically. I mean, I think tomorrow's the last off-season workout or mandatory mini camp practice that they're going to have until training camp. It's real. I mean, we are basically a full month and maybe a week or so away from the start of training camp, if you can believe it, when we'll all be down at St. John Fisher, enjoying the warm weather, watching those guys sort of congeal as a team. That's very soon to happen. So, but in terms of this last OTA, it's been a week. It's been an interesting week. Obviously, Josh Allen has been getting those sprinkled in first team reps, which is what Sean McDermott called part of the process. Part of what they had kind of put aside for him to do was to get some reps with the first team, but for a majority of the time work with the third team. But what's been most interesting, the developments that have been really taking place over the last 2 weeks, where we've seen a lot of Nathan Peterman running with the ones and AJ McCarron with the twos. That's really sort of been how it's played out for the portion of this week, where not only is Peterman playing with the ones, but he's been looking really good and competent doing so. I know that doesn't really strike a ton of confidence or strike a ton of fire into a lot of people's bellies. I know, I just did a piece on Nathan Peterman that'll be dropping tomorrow morning on cover1.net. You want to take a look at about maybe that's possible we wrote Peterman off too soon. That's kind of yet to be seen. But with some of the talk in the offseason workouts, it sounds like he's a guy that has a very firm grasp of the playbook and is sort of becoming a teacher on the field. I think is kind of what they're looking for in their quarterback. And not that the other two guys are sort of struggling with the playbook, but it just seems like Peterman has a really good understanding of what the coach is asking, and is sort of able to put the other guys in the right place. So Peterman's had a really strong spring. We'll see if that transitions into the summertime, but in terms of OTAs, that's got to be the story going into the season.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see, obviously, when they get pads on, and because one thing you can't do right now is make a lot out of it's a skill position time of year, right? Like the line is just kind of getting the
Right.
concepts down.
We've heard a lot about Robert Foster too, the wide receiver, the undrafted free agent out of Alabama. Obviously, gets
Right.
a leg up because he understands the principles of Brian Daboll's system, so he's able to sort of come in with that firsthand knowledge and sort of apply the raw skills, which is everybody has sort of talked about Foster since he was. A senior in high school going into Alabama as a top-ranked wide receiver. He was a starter his freshman year. An injury occurred, and then he just kind of got recruited over, which will happen at Alabama. So Foster's an interesting guy too, and you're right. You don't get to see a lot from the defensive and offensive line. Those battles are really going to start to happen coming into training camp, obviously. But Ryan Groy, it looks like, has got a firm grip. After we talked about the position a couple weeks ago, it really seemed like maybe Groy was on the outside looking in, and then all of a sudden the switch happened, and he hasn't looked back. So lots of fun stuff kind of happening as we move into the real stuff.
Okay. There. Make too much out of what the quarterbacks are doing just because they're, obviously it's not live bullets, pads aren't on, so the full rush isn't there, things like that. But it is exciting to see Peterman developing, because I thought from the day they picked him that he was a developmental quarterback, and maybe got thrown in a little too early. So to see that development increasing, obviously as a fan, I jumped all over him for the 5 interception half, but when you try to take that fan hat off and be a little bit less biased towards them, you got to understand that he's going to make strides, he's going to develop. So before people freak out that they see Peterman getting reps of the ones, it's okay for every player. So it's fun to see images and pictures of the Bills as fans. You've got for yard work or stuff around the house, man, just pile it on now, because it's going to be a long, cold stretch without football. And then training camp gets here and it flies right by. So let's jump into this defensive line, because we haven't got to see a lot, right?
And it's an interesting group.
It's a super interesting group. I think that, people talk about that the Bills are going to regress a lot. You hear a lot in the national media that the Bills are going to regress. But I think this is the one area where I feel much better about the positional group than I did a year ago, just in the depth itself, not even just starters, but all around. I think it's a better unit, and I think it's a really interesting group that's going to impact an already good group behind it and the defensive backs and an improved linebacking group. And I think this could be the keystone to creating a better defense than we saw last year. What do you think overall, that whole defense as a whole? How does that impact the whole defense?
Yeah, I think too what we're seeing as a unit defensively that I think is significantly ahead of the offense in terms of, I think, overall talent, but I think where they'll be when the season comes and towards the end of the season, I think you'll see a unit that has the capabilities of being a top 10, top 15 unit next year, just based on talent alone and what they've added. The defensive line specifically is an interesting group, because I think you can look at a lot of interesting individual stories sort of across the whole line, starting at the defensive end. Obviously, the addition of Trent Murphy, a guy who's kind of an interesting story in himself. Can he have a bounce back year after suspension and injury? So he's an interesting guy. Obviously, a lot of interesting talks about Jerry Hughes and his future, and with his high cap numbers here this year and next year, how does he sort of fit in? And then you move in the interior, the addition of Harrison Phillips, how does he fit in? Star Latuale. So there are tons of interesting developments at individual groups along the defensive line. But as a whole, Aaron, you mentioned it, the depth this year, I think, starts out significantly greater. Guys like Eddie Yarbrough aren't going to be asked to carry a significant load this year, although he's certainly going to play in. Their depth guys, I don't think, are going to get plunged into maybe bigger roles than they're maybe ready for or accustomed to. I think the depth is going to allow rotations this year that maybe they weren't able to get last year, to keep their guys like Jerry Hughes and to keep some of those pass rushers fresh throughout the game and especially throughout the season. So that's really where I think this whole conversation starts, Aaron, is the depth that they have acquired in the offseason, but more so the top end talent that they added. And I think maybe so far in the middle of that defense, maybe more than anywhere.
Yeah, and a name that you mentioned, Eddie Yarbrough, was a name that we heard all spring, all summer last year, and he had an okay season, but didn't live up to the hype of the summer. And then they bring in, I'm going to butcher his name, it's Awa Ziggy Dawa or whatever.
That's fair. That
fair.
was a good interpretation. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just say Awa, and you guys will have to know that that's who I'm talking about. But they bring him in, and it seems to be that he is getting a lot of the reps, and we haven't really heard anything about Eddie Yarbrough all spring. Are you concerned for him?
No. Yeah. I guess you have to, because I think he's the fourth defensive end right now.
Right.
We're going to talk about Shaq Lawson here, I'm sure, in a moment, and sort of how he fits in, the former first-round pick, and maybe what ends up happening with him. We'll have a lot to say about what happens with Eddie Yarbrough. But I think they like Yarbrough a lot. I think what he brings off the field. I think they like what the athleticism that he brings on it. So he was a good player in the run game. I thought he was. He's also an effective special teamer. So that's what makes I think Yarbrough maybe a little bit more valuable than Owa. I believe Owa is how you say his first name. Owa. So although Sean McDermott has mentioned him by name as being a guy that stood out to him during the minicamp here and the OTA process.
So, like you had said, Shaq Lawson, do you think maybe he's should be a little bit more concerned about his position with us hearing the name Owa and knowing that he's getting first team reps? Or do you think that's just part of the rotation that they're trying to build and keeping guys fresh? Or is Shaq Lawson, I brought up when the Julio Jones rumor popped up the other day, I asked a question out to people, what type of trade would you offer to get him? And almost the only name that came up was Jerry Hughes and Shaq Lawson, but Shaq Lawson came up a ton. Do you think he's safe on this roster, or are they going to try to move this kid, or what's the deal with Shaq? It's a big year for him.
It's a big year for him, and I think it's interesting to note you're talking about Shaq Lawson being on the second team. That's with Trent Murphy, who's going to be undoubtedly the first team ahead of Shaq Lawson at his position. When he's healthy and he's 100% ready for training camp, they're, basically easing him in. So that is maybe the most interesting part about this, is where Shaq Lawson fits in when Trent Murphy's back in 100%. And how does he fit in the depth role? Because I think there's going to be situations where I think Shaq Lawson is going to have an opportunity to play in the interior in passing downs and third down situations where they want a little bit more pass rushing depth. But you also have to take into account that Lorenzo Alexander is a guy that last year they really started transitioning away from the strong side, traditional stand-up linebacker role, to more of a hand in the ground, going to rush the passer role. So how does that affect where Shaq Lawson comes into the game and how he, sort of affects the way that the lineups happen defensively? So there are more than a number of factors about maybe what the future for Shaq Lawson holds. He wasn't drafted by this regime, which is important to note. He's a player that doesn't necessarily have any off-the-field issues, but he really doesn't check a few boxes that are important to Sean McDermott, that availability. Seems like a guy who maybe doesn't come into training camp last year with in the best shape, and I think it showed, and I think it put him behind the eight ball, and I think he can't afford for that to happen this year. The availability and the preparation, those two things for me are sort of lacking for him, and those things need to be sharpened up if he's going to be successful under this regime, because we know how important it is to them.
Yeah, and I think the best thing that the Bills have going for him, so when people talk about him as a trade asset, I don't really see it, because obviously his stock is lower than it's ever been in the NFL because he hasn't produced to the.
You don't trade on the low stock. You trade. Teams,
or at least
rising. Not going to get a lot back, right?
Yeah, he's dropping stock. He's not living up to the pick that he was picked at. So I don't see the value there for Bean to say, you know what, this guy is just carrying dead weight for us, and they're going to have a ton of money next year anyway, so that doesn't matter. And like you said, they're not going to get much in return. But the benefit to the Bills also is that this guy is really in a prove-it year. He has to prove it to the league that he's worth something, because he's not going to get any deal when his next deal comes around if he continues to perform at the level he's performing. So he really has a lot to prove. And I've always said that it's great to have players with a chip on their shoulder. You see it all the time with guys in contract years, have some of the best years of their lives. They get a big deal. You never hear from him again. So this is a win-win for the Bills. Either he performs at a much higher level and he's a usable asset, or he continues where he is and he's just kind of part of this defensive rotation. Like you said, maybe get him on the interior on third downs and hope that he produces. But what are your thoughts there? Do you think he has any value where they would even consider moving him?
Not really, and not unless the team's willing to give up if they're willing to take back like a conditional 7. If they're just trying to move him because they feel like guys are more valuable to them, then maybe. But I'd be shocked if he's traded just because he just isn't going to bring you much back. It's interesting because, one of the guys in the chat room here brings up Lawson admitted that he wasn't all in under Rex. But what was his excuse last season? Because last year, this was a defense that was tailor-made for him, if you remember. This was him going back to his position that he's familiar playing with in college and has really played throughout the course of his career. So what was the excuse last year? Where was that explosion that we saw from him when he was on that Clemson team that got him to be a first-round talent and put him in that position? That has seemed to go to the wayside, and that shoulder injury, I think, really, really set him back. And maybe a full season of being healthy in terms of what we know. And we know he had some injury issues last year with his leg, I believe his knee and his ankle. So if he can be 100% going into training camp, it's going to be a big, big benefit for him in terms of confidence, but in terms of the coach's trust that he's going to be a reliable guy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And another guy that keeps getting brought up in trade talks, and I don't get it. I don't understand this at all. I understand that he's an asset to the team, but he's still got a lot left in the tank, I think, is Jerry Hughes. People talk about him, and the way people talk about him in the conversations I've had, you would have thought that he had a terrible year last year. And one thing I want to point out is, yes, sacks were down, but Jerry Hughes does so much. When you go back and watch the Game Pass footage, the L22 stuff, he still pressures quarterbacks without getting sacks, and stuff doesn't always show up in the box scores, but Jerry Hughes was still getting pressure on quarterbacks throughout every game almost regularly, and was really the only player on the Bills to create any type of pressure on his own. Do you see him as a tradable asset? I mean, he's still got some in the tank, but the Bills, I feel like, would be crazy to trade him because they have no other guy that can just, Lorenzo has some moves, but can any other guy create on their own like he can?
I'd say Trent Murphy's going to be that guy and is likely the long-term replacement for Jerry Hughes. Listen, Jerry Hughes, you mentioned it, still has that quick off-the-ball get off that is elite. One of the better guys in the league at getting off the ball. The thing that you see here is the reason that I think maybe people talk about it is he does have an out this year in his contract, meaning he's going to have a dead cap hit regardless. But he's 29 years old this season. He's going to be making on the cap $10.4 million this year and $10.4 million next year. That's fairly high for a guy that hasn't broken into the double-digit sack category in more than 2 years. So he's got one additional year remaining, so he's going to be a free agent in 2020. The dead cap hit goes from $6.8 million this year to $2.9 next year. I'd say if any time he's going to get traded, it'd be going into next season, his last season, if that or even maybe as a cut. But if his season this year just doesn't turn out and he's not a guy that they can rely on, or he's goes back to the old Jerry where he's getting 5 or 10, 15-yard penalties during the season, you can't have that. And Sean McDermott won't have that. And there were times last year where he was sort of teetering and borderline pushing that envelope. So we'll see what happens to Jerry Hughes, but I think on the field he's still a guy that can defend the run surprisingly well for his size, but more so a guy that is probably your quickest guy off the line of scrimmage and the guy that maybe strikes the most fear in offensive linemen.
Yeah, I had thought that maybe he would be a surprise cut this offseason. When you're thinking about who are guys that would come out of left field that they would cut, I thought maybe. But then when I really just got to thinking about it, I don't know enough about Trent Murphy to know if he's the kind of guy that can replace Jerry Hughes as far as the supreme type of pass rushing that we've seen out of Jerry Hughes. Like you said, it has been 2 years since we saw that elite level of a pass rusher as far as sacks go. But I tell you right now, man, he's still got a lot of pressures on the quarterback. He didn't quite get there all the time. But, let's move a little bit to the interior of the line, because I think there was some disruption there last year where Kyle was really the only interior guy, and you bring in Starr. And I think guys like this are what's going to help those edge defenders and more importantly, the linebacker play a little bit more free and be able to create more pressure and do some more interesting things that they didn't have last year. Can you talk about the interior a little bit and your excitement there?
Yeah, I mean, Tremaine Edmonds is going to be very good friends with Star Latulele or Latulele, however you ultimately end up saying Star's name. But Star is going to be another guy that's really quick off the line of scrimmage for his size, young, comparatively to a guy like Kyle Williams next to him. Obviously, this is going to be a guy that plays the one technique. He's going to hopefully eat some double teams, be productive, but do what they wanted Marcel Darius to do and be. They ended up trading him and sort of, I would say, paid the same amount of money, but not too far off. I mean, they certainly paid Starr big money to go to be beside Kyle Williams, at least for one more season. But yeah, as I mentioned, he's going to be the best friend of Tremaine Edmonds because he's going to be able to blog up that middle of the field and, more importantly, help this team, who I thought struggled at times last year on plays like this, and zone up the middle. And that's sort of where a lot of teams gashed them. I think the Bills are significantly better up the middle this year with the additions of Starr and, of course, Harrison Phillips, who I'm sure we'll talk about here momentarily as well.
Yeah, I thought Starr was interesting. I wasn't sure that he's worth the money, but at the end of the day, it's not my money, so I don't care. He's there now, and I love this addition, like you said, especially after they drafted Edmonds. I think when you look at some of the stuff from the games last year, the tackles on run plays were happening 5-6 yards down the field. You look at the Saints game, that whole month of November, it was one of the most frustrating things I've ever had to watch, where teams were just clipping off 6 to 8 yard runs almost whenever they wanted. I think the Saints had like a record breaking drive of like 5 minutes of possession time or something.
All runs.
And I don't think you're going to be able to do that with guys like Starr and Kyle in the middle and Tremaine Edmonds behind him. So I think they immediately addressed that. I think that was a top priority. McDermott went with a guy that he knows, a guy that he's loyal to, a guy that knows his system, over paying a guy like Marcel Darius, continue to pay him what he pays him. You look at the PFF rating, it's not high. I think a lot of people, when they saw the signing of Starr, said, oh, this guy's older now and he's declined each year as of late. That Carolina defense has struggled lately, but I think if you talk to Luke Kuechly, and I think I've seen things, Luke Kuechly loved playing behind Starr. Yeah. So the stuff doesn't show up on PFF, but it shows up on the field, and it shows up for guys like you and Eric who watch tape and see, hey, man, how did Luke Kuechly get so free? Well, Starr was eating guys up. That's how it is. So what about Harrison Phillips? You brought up that name. You know, we all know about Kyle, so there's not a ton to sit around and talk about Kyle Williams. We've seen him forever. I think we know what to expect out of him. Even though he's aging, I think we're still going to get pretty much the same Kyle Williams. But Harrison obviously has some development to do. What do you see out of him, and what do you see his role in this defense?
I see him as a guy that could potentially play 40% of the plays this year, especially with Kyle Williams. I think him and Kyle are going to have a nice rotation at the 3 technique spot in this defense. I think you could see some Harrison Phillips up the middle at the 1 technique to sort of spell Star Lotulelei, maybe in pass rushing downs. Maybe you see on pass rushing downs a healthy balance of Harrison and Kyle Williams playing that 1 and moving moving Shaq Lawson into that 3 technique spot, as I mentioned earlier, in pass rushing downs. But, you know, it'll be interesting because I think it's going to be a matter of who can take over behind that 1 technique. Is it going to be Adolphus Washington? Can they trust him to play and be the main backup star this year? Or is Harrison Phillips going to be a guy that rotates in both those positions? I think that's going to remain to be seen. I would be shocked if that's the case. I think you'll see a lot of Phillips spelling Kyle Williams this year and playing a ton of 3 technique with the idea that he can play inside. As you can see here, one of the most effective run defenders in the country last year and really over the past 2 years, a relentless defender, a guy who's quick off the point of attack, but more so is very, very skilled with his hands and is sort of a nuanced pass rusher and can pass rush and be effective in the run game as well. So I'm excited to see what he does, but I think he's sort of Kyle Williams 2.0. I know that it's maybe unfair to say that before he's taken it down, but he's got that work ethic. He's sort of got that build, and he plays a very similar game. So you're not going to see a lot of this where it's just not a defense that the Bills are very familiar running. They may run some overlooks, but he's certainly not going to be the guy, or in underlooks as well, but he's certainly not going to be the guy that's lining up in the 1 technique a whole ton. He just doesn't have the size.
Yeah, the thing that I am most excited about, when we did the pre-draft thing, we talked about Harrison for the Bills, and Russell Brown, who does the Cover One draft podcast, said the same exact thing you just said. He said Kyle Williams 2.0 when he talked about him. And Eric pointed out to me, obviously, they aren't going to play the same position in the NFL, but that they were talking about the motor and things like that. What gets me even more excited when you hear those things, obviously we know what to expect out of Kyle and that type of motor, is that Kyle's still on the team. And you heard about it with Darius. Kyle taught him everything. He just opened up himself in all of his years of NFL preparation to Darius. And Marcel talked about it a ton. It made him such a better player. I think that a guy with similar makeup of Harrison will take that even further, that type of learning and training. And I've heard stories about, when guys are interviewed that nobody watches film like Kyle Williams. Nobody's more prepared than Kyle Williams. And if Harrison Phillips, as seems to be a really smart kid, if he can just muckle onto his hip all summer long and absorb every single thing Kyle Williams has to offer, I think that it can really accelerate his development. Where if he went somewhere else, maybe you don't get that. You get a guy that's not willing to teach you some of the things that he's learned. He doesn't want you to take his job. I think Kyle is more than happy to pass the torch to these young defensive tackles, which is a great position for Buffalo to be in.
And this is a good question too in the chat is, who do you think gets more reps this season, Harrison Phillips or Adolphus Washington? And I guess that's a good question, but I think you're looking at two guys that are going to be playing different positions along that interior defensive line. I think right now, looking at it, that Adolphus Washington's your shoe-in number 2 behind Star Lotulelei, and then you have Phillips as your shoe-in as sort of your number 2 to Kyle Williams in the 3 technique. But that can change based on, can Harrison Phillips play both positions? I think he can. I don't know that they want him to be. And it's going to be on how effective Star Lotulelei is. Is he going to be a guy that plays 75, 80% of the snaps? Or is there going to be a healthy rotation? Because if there is, and I think that's what they want, then I think you're going to see a lot of equal time between those two.
Yeah, and I think they know the age of Star and they know the age of Kyle Williams, and I don't think they're going to put those guys out here. They know it's a marathon of a season, and I do believe people try to look really into what Sean McDermott and Brandon Beane say at their different press conferences and things, and I actually think they're being a lot more honest than people think. When they talked about signing a bunch of defensive players, and Brandon Beane was like, I would take – if I could get 10 Pro Bowl defensive linemen, I would do it. Like, we can't have enough of these guys because we want to rotate them in and out. I think he was being 100% honest. I don't think there's any smoke screen there in any way of, well, we're getting these guys because we're going to trade Jerry Hughes, or we're getting these guys for – I think they really want as many guys as they can get and would rather have fresh legs in and out all the time. So I expect to see a lot of Adolphus Washington this year. I do expect to see a lot of Eddie Yarbrough. I think that's what gets me so excited about this unit this year is – maybe outside of the starters, you don't have a lot of names or guys that are up and coming, but I think you're not going to see a ton of drop off. You got guys that are going to be in position to make plays and come in and do their job, and they're not going to be asked to do it a ton. It's going to be a big rotation. So the depth alone, it gets me super excited about this unit. I think it's one of the most improved units on the team.
I think it's the most improved unit on the team, and I think maybe the second deepest. Maybe I'll say this. I think they're the deepest unit on the team now. I think they've maybe surpassed the defensive backs because I think the top 4 of the defensive backfield boasts maybe the most skilled and the most highly skilled unit of this team. But in terms of total depth, they can run two defensive lines. They can run 8 guys in there. And I think that's going to be a huge advantage for the Bills, that they can run 8 guys and have maybe that 9th guy be Lorenzo Alexander as an effective pass rusher on third down. So, yeah, the depth here is, I think, maybe the most interesting, and Lorenzo Alexander is a guy you got to talk about too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Zoe is a bit of a hybrid, right? So I didn't know really where we should fit him in, but you're right. He's going to be – he talked to somebody in the news about saying that he was going to be down more often. Towards the end of the year that they were putting his hand in the ground.
I talked to him earlier this offseason, and that was the first thing he said is he expects to be his hand in the dirt more. He expects to be more of a pass rushing role and maybe have limited snaps as a stand-up linebacker. And I think they'd like to run more nickel if they can, which means, guys like so some of those defensive backs are going to be asked to do a little bit more in terms of defending the run. We'll see, because I don't think necessarily we've seen the complete roster at strong side linebacker. I think they still may look to add a player that maybe gets cut from another team. But the defensive line position, as we talked about, I just think you look at it overall depth. They have and we haven't really even talked that much about Trent Murphy. We don't know a lot about him. He hasn't really been a full-time starter. He's been more so a depth player in Washington, who maybe has one of the best and deepest defensive lines in the league. So he's coming from a very deep unit to another deep unit. He's going to be an interesting guy because, again, if he's healthy, he provides them another quick twitch, other defensive end that can be really effective when you're talking about, can you have 2 guys at the outside? It'll be interesting. We'll see.
Yeah, and you brought up a great point. Because I always think about the defensive backs as the number 1 position group, but if a guy gets hurt there, I'm start to get really concerned. I don't know about the depth, but I actually feel okay with this position group, where if Kyle Williams goes down for a little bit, that we'll be able to get through a couple games, that the depth is good enough. I'm okay with Adolphus Washington getting a start for a game or two during the season. Obviously, It's not ideal, but that depth, people always confuse depth as you have another starter behind you, but you just have to have a guy that's a stopgap guy that can get you through a game or two, and you need it. It's a marathon season, so I love the way they've built this line, and there's some guys down towards the bottom that aren't going to get a lot of play here. Maybe a couple special teams guys, but is there anyone on the roster that you think could really surprise some people this summer, move their way up the depth chart?
It'd be hard. I think maybe the surprise will be the one candidate you could see as a surprise candidate is Shaq Lawson. Is he one that can come in early and show that he's in shape and that he's got that quick twitch and he's got that burst back? Because that's what I think a lot of fans were waiting for. I know that's what the front office is waiting for, what Sean McDermott and Leslie Frazier are waiting for is, can he be an effective pass rusher? Because if he can't, listen, he's a responsible run defender. He's a guy that can set the edge. But at the end of the day, that's not what first-round picks are there for. That's a replacement-level player. There are tons of responsible run defenders at the defensive end position. Can he provide pass rushing help? Can he get to 7 sacks, which I mentioned in the chat is, I think, a reasonable number for any of your top pass rushers. And if he's a top 3 pass rusher in this team, 7 sacks has got to be a number that he's striving for. He's got to get over the hump this year in a pivotal third season.
Yeah, a guy that I really liked when the Bills got him, and nothing has transpired for him. But I always fall in love with a guy or two like this all the time, almost every Bills team through the drought, was Markevious Lewis. And I don't know that he can find a home on this roster, but out of college, he had some interesting ability, and I don't know if a guy like Shaq falls off the roster or something like that. Eddie Yarbrough just doesn't live up to the success he had a summer ago. Can any of these guys creep in if they put together a really nice summer?
Yeah, there's certainly going to be a possibility for that. I don't know, the other guy that I could see maybe them finding a way to replace is Adolphus Washington. I know that there were times last year where he was put in a couple of situations with personal foul penalties that they didn't like. They were undisciplined penalties. He's got to clean that stuff up. Obviously, he's had off the field issues before, so that's something to watch. He's another guy I think that could be potentially replaced. I just don't know that they have the guy that's to the level that you're going to be able to get from Adolphus Washington, who's a very capable pass rusher. We heard everything coming out of college that he was a really good pass rushing defensive tackle, but maybe lacked in the run defending. I thought he's been very responsible run defender for this team and a very decent replacement level guy. So a guy that you're talking about, you wouldn't mind if he had to come in for a couple games. That is Adolphus. You wouldn't really miss too much. If Adolphus comes in, he's not going to be a noticeable drop-off, which is important because that's what you sort of need in this league. As Brandon Bean mentioned, having guys that can sort of rotate in and out. I think the fact that they can go 8 is going to be a huge advantage for them all season.
Do you think Shaq is almost competing with Adolphus for that pass rushing interior D line? Obviously you can't have all these guys on the field on third down.
Right.
If Shaq becomes that guy, does that push Adolphus's what he's best at kind of out the window and make him less valuable?
It's a good question, and Eric mentioned here in the chat as well that Lorenzo talked about last season working down with the 3 technique as well. So that means that are those reps that you're taking away from Adolphus as well? Whose reps are those taking away? Because you want to have Lorenzo out there rushing the passer. So again, it's going to be interesting how it plays out because if they decide to keep 8 defensive linemen or 7 because you can have Lorenzo as a replacement defensive lineman, that's going to be a huge thing in terms of roster numbers, considering that it looks like they're going to carry 4 running backs and they might carry 5 or 6 receivers. So roster numbers and Shaq Lawson could be a very interesting storyline as we continue moving forward, and we'll see in terms of Adolphus Washington as well.
So what do you think the magic number is here? And you can break it down between ends and tackles or as the unit as a whole. What do you think the magic number is? We talked about it for other position groups because this one's going to be an interesting one. I think that there's going to be some talent that gets cut. So what do you think that number is that they carry on the 53? I
would think that they wouldn't carry 9. 9's a high number. I think you get like 2 guys at each position, unless you have someone that just shows that you would rather have. The problem is defensive linemen typically aren't playing a ton of important special teams roles. Right. Those guys aren't out there covering kicks, punts, and on punt return and kick return. So that's the problem with a position like that. So I think that 8 is probably the lucky number there, and I think that it's going to put a lot of guys on the fringe of this roster. You mentioned that the Owa gentleman, again, I don't know how to say his last name. So
I think it's Odigizua.
Odigizua. Okay, Owa Odigizua. I like that. So if
I want him just for the name, I want to hear.
I would like to hear John Murphy say it. Honestly.
Yeah.
So, but no, it'll be interesting. That battle for Eddie Yarborough, Shaq Lawson, and him is who sort of comes out on top of that.
Yeah, and so if you say 8, and I don't disagree entirely, but I do think somebody talented is going to end up shaking off this roster, and I think Eddie Yarborough might be the guy on the outside looking in, because it seems to me, at least from OTAs, and I know you can't read a lot out of OTAs, and I try not to, but the fan in me just jumps all over it like a dog on a bone, any piece of news. And I've been hearing Odigizua a few times now and getting in that rotation, and me not hearing Eddie Yarborough causes some concern. I said it before, maybe he's already flamed out, but I think he's still a talented guy. So one of these talents is going to not make this roster, which is a great thing for Bills fans to know. That I feel like it's been a while since that bottom part of the rotation on the defensive line has been a very top-heavy defensive line for a few years, that there's some talent there that's probably going to get cut along with the fat, this summer. And you, like you said, you had Lorenzo Alexander into there. Does that mean that they maybe cut 2 of these guys, since I was going to be playing, more in there? I don't know. It's going to be a really interesting position group to watch. So who do you think, though, going into it are the starters? Because I think on most sites right now, Shaq Lawson still listed as your left end. What do you think is going to be the starting 4 for your defensive line?
I think it'll be Jerry Hughes, Star Lotulelei, Kyle Williams, and Trent Murphy. That's who I think it'll be across the board. Your starting defensive line to start the season with, Harrison Phillips and Adolphus Washington as your second team. And it'll be interesting out of those 3. It's going to be those 3, and the last one that doesn't make the roster, as you mentioned, there's going to be a good football player that's left off this roster, I think. You're right.
Yeah, I tend to agree, but I could see being surprised at the other end position, because I think they might want – something tells me that they want to rotate Hughes and Murphy as the primary pass rusher and not necessarily put them both in at the same time, but keep fresh what they deem as the best pass rushers on their team, rotating in and out. So that's something that I'm going to look for once training camp gets in, is how are they putting 2 pass rushers in at the same time? Because you still, I think one thing Shaq did pretty well last year, and again, it doesn't show up on the stat sheet all the time, and defending the run is really an 11-game thing. But I think he did a really good job of holding his spot and allowing Jerry to be the pass rusher and trying to just keep containing. And it doesn't show up on stat sheets, but I think he did a good job at that. So I could see them still keeping a guy over there to do that.
It's just going to be, at the end of the day, it's a numbers game. It's who can help them on special teams. We know how important that is to them. That's why a guy like Tywan Jones or Travaris Cadet, who are both battling out as a punt returner right now, though that's going to be the difference, is who's going to be their primary punt returner for that position. They don't have that sort of thing to fall back on, the defensive lineman.
Sure, yeah. No, it's going to be a really fun group to watch. I'm super excited once training camp gets here, because, again, in OTAs, you don't get really anything out of these guys. They're not going, they're slap fighting, basically.
Preseason games are going to be big for these guys. There's no doubt about it. Yeah,
and the summer is really short, so these guys that are really trying to push each other out of the spots, it's going to get intense, I think. I think that's the area you're going to start seeing people fighting and things like that, because jobs are on the line, man, on this defensive line. And it's a great thing to see, because McDermott and Bean talk about, they want to create this type of competition across the roster. And we just got done talking about the offense, and that type of competition just doesn't exist in this, not in the same way that we're seeing right there, at least. So it's a fun position group, guys. We did have one question here that I want to just check to make sure we didn't really go over. Josh McCarty at Josh_McCarty28 asks, how high is Shaq Lawson's upside? If he puts it all together, can he ever be a guy who bends the edge consistently in the passing game? Or even at his best, he's more of an edge setter in the run game, serviceable pass rusher. So we've talked about Shaq a lot. Tell me where his ceiling is. If he can really turn this thing around, can he be the guy that they drafted?
I don't think that he's a bender. I don't think that he is the kind of guy that you see that's beating guys out with speed rush to the outside. I don't think he's necessarily strong enough to beat guys with a bull rush, not left tackles in this league. I don't think he has the size or strength for that. I think he's a very responsible run defender. I think he's that can set the edge. Can he do it as an elite defender against the run? I don't think so. He just has, I think he has disappointing athleticism. I was expecting to see more of that power, that burst, that athleticism that you saw at times in college, but he just doesn't have the size or the length, the arm length that you see in the NFL. And his arms are very, they're not small, but he gets pushed around a little. And that's the Taylor Lewans, you name them. These great left tackles in the league are difficult to beat. And if you can't beat them with your hands, and you can't beat them with your feet, you don't have a ton left.
Yeah, I think it's hard. I hate deciding what guys' ceilings are. But if I had to, you're asking that question, I would say that I don't think that he can ever live up to his draft status. I think it's unfair to ask guys to live up to their draft status. They don't choose Doug Whaley to pick them high. It just happens. So I think that's an unfair thing. But I do think that he can be a serviceable guy for another quite a few years in this league as a rotational defensive line player, whether he's moving in on third downs or whatever. I think I'd be happy if they kept him and if they, signed him to a modest deal to keep him as another rotational guy. I think that you'll hear his name throughout his career and he'll be a serviceable player. And I think that's good. That's not a bad thing.
Right.
But because of where he was picked, people, obviously the expectation's a lot higher. And to me, I've always thought it's very hard, the whole Sammy Watkins thing. Like, you can't blame Sammy for them trading up to take him there. Like, he didn't make them do that. It's hard to hold a guy to that pick. So that's it, though. We didn't get a ton more questions as far as the defensive line. If you thought we missed anything, hit us up on the YouTube comments. Come get at us on Twitter. Nate is going to let you know where to find him here in a second. We would love to talk to you about the defensive line over on Twitter or anywhere. You want to come talk to us in the Slack. Again, it's $10 right now for the premium content that gets you access to the Slack channel, access to the film room, access to content that isn't available to the public. We put out a couple quick audio pieces recently that just go to premium members. So Eric's really having us as the contributors ramp up on the premium content. So the deal is only getting better and better by the day. And speaking of content, man, Nate, what do you got coming out? I know you had mentioned you got a couple articles, maybe a Nathan Peterman article drop, and tell us what you got, man.
Fire takes is what I got. I got Nathan Peterman article coming out this week. I got another one about the state of the defense compared to the offense. We talked a little bit about that today, and then being a little further ahead. So we'll have that out next week. But the one that you'll want to pay attention to tomorrow morning, dropping Nathan Peterman. Of course, you can follow me on Twitter at Nate Geary WGR. As you mentioned, Aaron, I'd love to get into it with people. So tweet at me, and I'll make sure I get to a response.
Absolutely. And if you're watching here live on YouTube, we appreciate it. If you're listening to the podcast, you can join us live on YouTube. We typically go every Wednesday around 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We're going to finish off the defense here coming up. And it's going to be some great conversations. This side of the ball, obviously, like Nate said, a little bit ahead of where the offense is at. And I think that they're going to take that next step into becoming one of the top defenses in the league here. Young unit. So join us as we talk about each positional group. And then we're going to jump into all the different topics you want throughout the season. So you can jump into on YouTube, you can jump into the chat box with us. We're all over there chatting. But make sure you head over to cover1.net. Even if you don't do the premium, look at all this. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see all this content. I mean, most of this stuff was fresh up in the last 24 hours. So we're pumping it out, man. You got to get over and check it out. And so check back in with us, man. Next Wednesday, 7 p.m., I think we're going to move back into the linebackers, which, again, another unit that is going to be a lot of fun to talk about. I'm hoping to get Eric on for that one because I know Eric's got a lot to say about linebackers. So, again, I'm Aaron Quinn. You can find me at Aaron Quinn 716. Follow Cover One, all the social media platforms. You know where to search for us, Cover One. Go subscribe to the podcast. Leave us a review. We can't do this without you guys. We appreciate all the fans, and we'll see you guys next week.